Section B. The limits of the labor theory of property. It is clear from the writings of Hutcheson, Dalrymple, and Keynes that the labor theory was being used by the Scottish writers as the basis for a theory of natural property rights, which they presented as an alternative to the theory that property originated with a contract, one they associated with both Grotius and Pufendorf. However, for none of them was the labor theory used as a theory of occupation. Carmichael's teachings had been ambiguous in this respect. On the one hand, in arguing against Pufendorf's theory that property must begin with a pact, he shows a clear preference for Locke and refers the reader to Chapter 5 of the Second Treatise of Government. However, Carmichael follows this discussion with a traditional natural law explanation of the Roman rules of property acquisition: occupation, accession, succession, and usucapion, or prescription. Carmichael's account of these rules owes more to Grotius than to any other writer, and there is no attempt to incorporate the principle of labor into his explanations. Occupation of land, for example, requires merely the entry on the place with a declared intention of occupying it, and the occupation of movable things, such as animals, can be made by hand or by the use of instruments such as traps. In both these cases, Grotius, rather than Pufendorf or Locke, is the authority. This is not entirely inconsistent. Carmichael's arguments about the significance of labor could be read in the following way. It cannot be the case, as Pufendorf says, that occupation requires agreement because God had intended the world and its resources to be used by human beings in a beneficial and secure way. Most things that are useful require labor, and if it were permissible for someone to take from us what we had taken from the common and improved with our labor, they would be stealing the fruit of our labor, and that would be wrong. It is essential, Carmichael concludes, that occupation gives us right. Now, this is not so much a labor theory of occupation in the sense that laboring is somehow the criterion for a successful occupation, but an explanation of why there must be a right of occupation. In his System of Moral Philosophy, Hutcheson also built his theory of occupation on the traditional natural law argument, which begins with the idea that the world was originally a gift to all mankind from God, and was thus intended for our use. He then argues, much as Grotius, Locke, and Carmichael, but not Pufendorf, had done, that if we take seriously the idea that God had intended the material world to be used for our support, it follows that we must have, at least, a right to make use of it. If it were allowable, Hutcheson argues, for a second comer to frustrate the innocent impulse of the first, then it would be allowable for a third to frustrate the second, and so on. The result of this would be that God's purpose in making the original grant would be entirely defeated. Hutcheson reaches this important conclusion without reference to labor, and he concludes, the first impulses of nature towards supporting ourselves, or those who are dear to us, point out the right of the first occupant to such things as are fit for present use. Obstructing this innocent design, when there is enough for others, an obvious reference to Locke, is morally evil. However, population pressure meant that mankind could not continue to support itself by using the world as it was. It was necessary to labor, and it is at this point that Hutcheson brings in the labor theory to justify what he calls further rules of property in shepherding and farming societies. Nature, he says, has given us powers and ingenuity, and a disposition to exert them in supporting ourselves and those we love. We have a sense of the innocence of exerting our natural faculties, and a sense of resentment against anyone who would obstruct us in doing so. It is from these strong feelings that we discover the right of property that each one has in the fruits of his own labor. Thus, Hutcheson says that there are two original methods of acquiring property: occupation and labor employed in cultivating. In A Short Introduction to Moral Philosophy, however, Hutcheson had taken a different approach. Instead of claiming the existence of two original principles of acquisition, he provides his own gloss on the law of occupation, claiming that the successful occupant is the person who has performed the most labor in the chase or search for the thing. If two people have expended the same amount of labor in acquiring an object, it becomes jointly owned. In Carmichael and Hutcheson, then, the labor theory makes its appearance in a rather uncomfortable fashion alongside traditional natural law arguments about occupation. The general purpose is to remove completely the idea that property depended on agreements, and the labor theory was being used to buttress the traditional arguments exactly at the points at which they seem to need some reinforcement by reference to agreements or conventions. In the writings of Kames and Dalrymple, however, the natural law theory of occupation, together with its premise that the world was originally a gift from God, drops out of the picture. God continues to make an appearance in the works of both Kames and Smith, but as designer in the Stoic or deist form of the author of nature, rather than as a provider. This means, among other things, that it was no longer possible to rely on this premise to justify the first private uses of natural resources. In fact, Kames and Dalrymple have very little to say about this, as their primary interest is in landed property after the invention of agriculture, and it is in this context that they take up the labor theory as it had been used by Hutcheson. In Essays on the Principles of Morality and Natural Religion, first published in 1751, Kames built his theory of property on the idea that man is fitted for labor and must labor to survive. We have a natural disposition to support ourselves and our families by our own labor, and this disposition, Kames says, involves the idea of property. The ground I cultivate and the house I build must be considered as mine, otherwise I labor to no purpose. There is a peculiar connection betwixt a man and the fruits of his industry, felt by everyone, which is the thing we call property. Given this disposition to support himself by his own efforts, man would be an absurd being without this sense of property, and he would be an imperfect one if he did not acknowledge the same disposition in others. The idea of property, then, springs from inclinations and dispositions that are natural to man and implanted in him by the author of nature. This is illustrated, Kames says, by the fact that however far back we go in human history, we find that people always had their own property. However, at this stage in the development of his ideas, Kames thought that even in the earliest times people had kept cattle. For even before agriculture was invented, when men lived upon the natural fruits of the earth, though plenty of pasture made separate possessions unnecessary, yet individuals had their own cattle and enjoyed the produce of their cattle separately. In an essay towards a general history of feudal property in Great Britain, published in 1757, John Dalrymple focused, as Kames had done, on landed property. He argued that agriculture leads men to bestow thought and labor upon land, and this increases their connection with a single portion of it. This connection, long continued, produces an affection, and this affection, long continued, together with the other, produces the notion of property in land. The significance of this work is not that it adds anything to Kames' attempt to explain the basis of the natural right of property, but that it is regarded as the first appearance in English of the four stages of theory. Much scholarly attention has been given to the question of whether Dalrymple's version of the stages theory includes a clear statement of the fourth stage, but for our purposes the most important point to note is that it includes a clear statement of the first stage of hunters and fishers prior to pasturage. Hutcheson had referred to such an age in his account of occupation, but had followed Grotius in saying that this first stage was followed by pasturage and farming together. Kames had distinguished pasturage from farming, but had failed to distinguish clearly an age of hunters, fishers, and gatherers prior to shepherding. However, having introduced or reintroduced the age of hunters and fishers, Dalrymple passes over it with the remark that property will be confined to movables with immovables held in common. And there is no discussion of whether the principles that explain property in movables in this age differs from the principles that explain properties in immovables in the subsequent ages. In the 1758 edition of his Essays, Kames made a number of significant revisions to his account of property. Men, he now says, originally supported themselves by hunting and gathering. However, this was an unnatural state for man, who was not designed to be an animal of prey. He needs regular supplies of food, and so he turned to shepherding, and then to farming. Kames explains this early progress of men in terms of a hoarding disposition that he shares with some other animals, and it is this hoarding disposition that does much of the explanatory work that was done by the disposition to support ourselves through labor in the 1751 edition. However, he concludes, much as before, by declaring, "The cattle tamed by an individual and the fields cultivated by him were held universally to be his from the beginning. A relation is formed betwixt every man and the fruits of his labor. The very thing we call property, yours and mine, are terms in all languages, familiar even among savages." But despite the fact that Kames here says that the idea of property is known to savages, there is still no satisfactory account of property in the first age of society. It had become apparent by the second edition of Kames' Essays that there was a major problem in combining a stadial account of property with a theory of the natural right of property that depended upon a natural human disposition. The gradual emergence of three distinct stages was bringing to light the fact that property differed between stages in terms of the rights and powers it conferred on the property holder. A labor theory of property, however, or one that depended on a hoarding disposition, seemed incapable of allowing for these differences. This became clearer still with the publication in 1758 of Kames' Historical Law Tracts. In this work, there is an explicit appearance of a first stage of hunting, which is not relegated, as before, to an unnatural prehistory of man. Moreover, Kames now says that property exists in this first stage and that it is the product of art and industry, by which the hunter and fisher acquire ownership by occupancy in their catch, and also by another principle, the principle of appropriation, that replaces the hoarding principle. However, Kames also explicitly brings to the fore the fact that property in its first age does not extend beyond possession. The introduction of shepherding extended property somewhat beyond possession, and the introduction of property in land extended it still further. To account for these developments, Kames now turns to a completely different kind of explanation. Savages, he says, are incapable of abstract thought and cannot conceive of the idea of property beyond actual physical possession. They cannot distinguish moral powers from physical powers, and so property is lost whenever it cannot be physically defended. Shepherding extends the powers and scope of property because the connection between the shepherd and his animals creates a bond between them that lasts beyond actual physical possession. But it is with the invention of agriculture and the beginning of a settled way of life that property finally becomes detached from possession. The problem Kames now faced was clear. If labor, or the disposition to hoard or appropriate, or some other natural principle, was the explanation of a natural right of property, why do property and the powers it gives differ so much in the different ages? And why, in particular, is property confined to possession in the first age? Kames' attempt to graft on to his natural rights theory the Humean idea that our moral ideas are the result of impressions on the mind that become more complex as our experience of the world develops is hardly a satisfactory solution. What was lacking from the theories of Kames and Dalrymple was an explanation of the basis of property in the first age of society, and an explanation of how property developed over time. It was the need to answer these two questions, I suggest, that prompted Smith to reformulate his own ideas on property in relation to the four-stage theory, and in doing so to adapt ideas he found in the theory of Grotius.